Hello guys, and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video we'll be continuing the recipe app project, and we'll be looking at how to build the recommended for you section and the recipes of the week section as well. Now in order to build these two sections, we are still going to use the MailDB API, and more specifically we are looking at the random mail endpoint. So there is an endpoint here, which is the mailapi.com API JSON v1 /random.php, and this should return a random mail each time you make a request to this endpoint. So we will build the recommended for you and the recipes of the week by making multiple calls to this API to get a list of random mails. And let's get right in and see how this is going to look in code. So over here I'm at the recipes page, and in this list view, this is where we are going to have our recommended for you section. So under this comment, I'm going to put a row here, and within this row I'll have children, and the first child is going to be the text recommended for you, and the next child will be the button. So we have a text button here, and the child will be a text that says see more. Now the next thing we need to do is to have a space between these two widgets. So I'm going to use the main axis alignment and set it to main axis alignment the space between. Now we need to also have some kind of space between the categories and the recommended for you section. So I'm going to wrap, and there are so many ways you can do this. I'm going to wrap this in a padding widget and give it a padding only top of 20. Right, so this is going to create a good enough space for me for the recommended for you section. Next, I'm going to change the style for the text over here so that it's the same as the categories text we have. So style, and we are looking for theme.texttheme and title large text style. Next is the actual recommended for you mails, right, or recipes. So just like I described, we are going to use the maildb.com /random API endpoint. Now this API endpoint returns a data that is slightly different from the basic recipe model we've been using up to now. So this is an expanded version of the basic recipe model. Because of that, we are going to create an extension for our basic recipe. So back here we have a basic recipe entity which works for displaying recipes under specific categories. So when I go to chicken, the recipe we see over here is a basic recipe. It just has an image and then a name as well as an ID and nothing more. Whereas this mail has more information than the basic recipe. So let's create a new file here under entities, new file, and let's call it complete recipe.dat. Now this is going to be a class complete recipe that extends basic recipe. And is that we are seeing, or that we are creating a super constructor from this. So we are going to have our super constructor that satisfies the basic recipe. Then after that we can have the fields specific to the complete recipe. So if you are new to this, we are saying that complete recipe should have everything that a basic recipe has. So when creating a complete recipe, it means that it should have an ID, a name, and an image URL, just like the basic recipe it extends. Right, that should be the simplest explanation for this in case you are confused about it. Now let's look at the actual fields we will need for a complete recipe. So if we look at a complete recipe over here, we have the category, which is a string, we have instructions, we have the image, we have some kind of tags, right? We have a YouTube URL, ingredients, and then measure as well, which is how much of each ingredient you should use. So the first thing I'm going to add after the ID name and image URL is going to be the category. So I'm going to create a field called category here, and then I'm also going to create a field for the area, just in case you want to use that in your UI for your own project. I'm also going to create a string for instruction, and then create a list of ingredients, right? So a list of ingredients, and at the moment we don't have anything called ingredients, so we are going to create it really quick. But before that, let's continue with a string called YouTube URL, which will be this URL we have over here, right? YouTube URL. And finally, we are going to have a list of string called tags. Let's proceed to create the ingredient. So what is an ingredient? Now, an ingredient would have the name of the ingredient, which is, let's assume in this case, fries, the measure of that ingredient, and an image URL for that particular ingredient. So if we are looking at garlic sauce, we should know the name, which is garlic sauce. We should know how much of garlic sauce we are looking for, which is 500 grams, and we should also have an image for a garlic sauce. So that's how we are going to build our model for our ingredients. So over here, I'm going to create a new entity, and you can put it in the same file, which is this file. I just prefer to have it in a separate file, so I'm going to create a new file and then call it ingredient. Now this is going to be a class just like any of our entities. So ingredient, and then we are going to have the field, so name. We are going to also have a string called measure, and then we are going to have a string for image URL. Now let's just require this in a constructor, and just like any of our entities, we need to be able to convert it to a map and also create an ingredient class from a map. So I'm going to create a factory constructor, which is going to be ingredients.fromJSON, or you can also call it from map, it doesn't really matter, and that is going to take in name, measure, and then image, and retain as an ingredient class. Let's also add a to map, so a map of string and dynamic, and then we call that method to map, or you can also call it to JSON, it doesn't really matter how you call it, and that is going to return a map of name, measure, and then image. So there is all that we need for an ingredient. Now back to complete recipe, we can import this ingredient here like this, and we need to also require the new fields we've added to this complete recipe. So we have to make sure that we are requiring this category, the area, the instructions, as well as the tags. The next thing we need to work on is how we convert a complete recipe or a JSON like this into a complete recipe. So that is going to be our from map or from JSON constructor, factory constructor, depending on how you decide to call it. So I'm going to create a factory constructor, and just to stick with how we've been doing it, I'm going to call it complete recipe.fromJSON, right? So this is going to be our factory constructor, and it's going to return a complete recipe like this. Now it would have been very good if everything we are looking for was formatted this way. So ID, image, category, area, instructions, ingredients, everything was formatted this way. But unfortunately, the response from the API doesn't return the information we need in this particular format. We need to do a little bit of massaging to get the information the way we want it. For instance, when it comes to ingredients, we don't have any field on this JSON called ingredients. We have to map the ingredients key over here to the measure key in order to get the actual ingredients class we have, right? So that's not going to work. As well as tags to is a string, so we need to make sure that we are splitting it on a comma in order to get a list of strings. So instead of just returning a complete recipe like this, we are going to do some kind of manipulation. Now the first thing we are going to do is we are going to create a list of ingredients, so a list of ingredients, and we are going to call it ingredients, and set it to an empty list to start with. So there's ingredients, and then we're also going to have a list of string and then call it tags. Now, how do we extract, or how do we combine str ingredient 1 with str measure 1? What I'm going to do is I'm going to loop over this object and then match anything that begins with str ingredient a number. So let's assume that there is going to be an index in a loop. So str ingredient 1, str ingredient 2, str ingredient 3, and look for anything else in this particular object or map that also starts with str measure the same index. So if it is 1, I'm looking for str ingredient 1 compared to str measure 1. str ingredient 2 should be compared to str measure 2. And if you don't really understand what this means, don't worry, I'm going to write the code for you to see how this will look like. If we look at this, it ends at str ingredient 20, which means that we are expecting a maximum of 20 ingredients. At least that's what I assume. So I'm going to create a for loop to extract the ingredients. I'm going to put a comment over here, extract the ingredients, and this is going to be a loop. So for elements, and I'm going to create this an int I equal to 1, and I wasn't supposed to do like this. So for int I equal to 1, I less than or equal to 20, I plus plus. So I'm just looping 20 times starting from 1 and make sure that I'm just ending at 20. For each loop, what we are going to do is that we are going to look for the ingredient and then the measure. So I'm going to create a variable called ingredient and then set it to JSON string str ingredient name. So for the first loop, this is going to be 1, right? So str ingredient 1, and we are expecting that to match something over here. And we've also set it optional, which is the string question mark, because sometimes it can be null. In this case, where we are going to get a null, so we have to make sure that we are not setting this a string. That is going to be our ingredients. Now, getting the measure, we're also going to do the same thing, which is string measure is equal to JSON, and then we are looking for str measure. Now we only want to add an ingredient when we have the actual name of the ingredient and then the measure, right? So if we have an ingredient without its measure, we don't want to add it to our list of ingredients. Now let's make a check over here. So if our ingredient is not equal to null, which means we have an actual ingredient, and our ingredient is not empty, so we need to make sure that we are also removing empty strings from this ingredient. Just like in this case, all these are empty strings, and we want to make sure that we don't add empty ingredients to our list. So if ingredient is not null and then ingredient is also not empty, that's for the ingredient check. Now let's make sure that our measure is also not null and empty. If this is the case, then we want to add this particular ingredient to our list of ingredients we have over here. So ingredients.add, and then we want to have ingredient, the name of the ingredient, and then the measure. Now how do we get the image URL? So in order to get the image URL, MailDB provides an endpoint. So if you scroll down a bit, ingredient thumbnail images. So we have www.maildb.com/images ingredients, then you put the name of the ingredients there, and that's it. You are going to get the image for that ingredient. So let's put our ingredient, the name of our ingredient there, which is the actual variable we call ingredient. I would prefer to rename it to something like maybe name, right, so that it makes sense. Image URL is going to be https://themaildb.com images ingredients, the name of the ingredient dash small.jpg, and the reason is that I'm looking for the smaller version of the ingredients, and we have to make sure the small is capital S and not small s. right? So that is going to give us a smaller version of the ingredients instead of a big image. Now if you want a big image, you can remove the small, but for our use case we will need the smaller version of the ingredient image. And this is going to leave us with tags. So how do we extract the tags? Now what I'm going to do is, it's not all mails that have tags. So when I refresh, maybe if you are lucky or good, we will get a mail that doesn't have any tag. So we first have to make sure that the tags we are looking for are actually there. I'm going to create a variable just below here, and I'm going to call it temp tags, which is temporary tags, and I'm going to set it to str tags, which is the field from the JSON. Now we first have to make sure that this temp tags is not null, right? So if it's not null, then it means we have some tags that we can split based on a comma and then add it to our list, right? Our list of tags over here. So what I'm going to do is first make sure that if temp tags is not equal to null and temp tags is not empty, which means it's not an empty string, then what we want to do is we want to set our list of tags to be equal to temp tags dot split on a comma. So we want to split everything based on a comma separated. Let's assume we have comma separated tags, right? But it happens that the third item in this comma separated tags is empty. Then that is going to create an empty tag, right? We don't want that. We want to filter out and make sure that each tag we split doesn't contain an empty string. So how do we do that? We make sure that after splitting we map through. So we map, and for each tag we trim the tag. That means that if there is a tag with space before or after it, we are going to remove that space. That is not enough. We have to also make sure that we are only retaining tags that are not empty. So for each tag that we are trimming, to remove white spaces from the left and the right, we have to also make sure that where the tag is not empty, then we can finally convert this to a list. So if you look at what we are doing, we just split on a comma, make sure that we've trimmed everything, and then make sure we move empty tags from the list, finally convert it back to a list, and then we set that as our tags. So we can therefore use the ingredients and then the tags over here. So instead of ingredients like this, we are going to rather pass our ingredients here, and instead of tags like this, we are going to pass our tags here. Now this is how we get a complete recipe. Next thing we want to do is to call this API, which would return us our data, right, for the complete recipe. So just like we've done always, come to your provider, and we are going to create a new provider over here. So providers, new file, and I'm going to call it random recipe provider .dat. Now this is going to be a future provider, just like all the providers we've been working with so far. So if you are in VS Code or Android Studio, you can just type Riverpod future and you should get an autocomplete like this, right? And I'm using annotation, so Riverpod future will give you something like this, and we need to provide what the return type for this particular future. So we are going to return a list of complete recipe, and then we are going to call it random recipe. And if you remember from the other videos, I told you guys that we don't need to add the name provider to it because Riverpod does that automatically. So now let's import everything that we need. So I'm going to import Riverpod. Also make sure that we are importing Riverpod annotation, and for now we can just return an empty list. Now this random recipe provider would be used at least more than once, right? So for the random recipes that we will put over here, and also for the recommended recipes. So the first question is, how many recipes do we want to generate? We don't really know. So what we are going to do is we are going to allow this random recipe provider to accept an optional limit or number of recipes to return, and we are going to have a default value for that. So after the ref parameter, let's add something like a count or limit or anyhow we want to call it, but I want this to have a default value. So to create an optional position parameter, we are going to use the square brackets like this and then call it count or limit. So int count and then set it to a value, so equal to 10. And this is how you create an optional positional parameter. If you want to learn more about functions and that, you can check the that docs, right? But this is how you do it. So there is the number of recipes or complete recipes we would like to return from this provider by default if no count is provided. So just like any of our providers, we have already set up the base URL, which is the MariaDB API JSON v1/1, right? And whenever I want to make a request to any of the endpoints, we basically just add the last part of it. So in this case, it's going to be random.php. Now, how do we make 10 or 20 requests in order to get 20 different recipes or random recipes? So the way we are going to do it is that we are going to loop the number of count times. So if count is 10, it means we are going to loop 10 times to make 10 different requests to this endpoint. Now, how this is going to look is like this. So we are going to have responses, and that is going to be set to list.generate, and the number of times you want to loop depends on the count over here. So count, and the generator is just a function, so a function that has index, and then it basically makes an API call. So dio.get/random.php, and we have to make sure we import dio here. So basically all that we are doing is we are looping 10 times when there is no count provided, 10 times, and for each time we loop, we just make a call to the random API endpoint. Now we can remove this variable because we are not really using it. Now this is going to create a list of features, so we have to make sure that we are awaiting all of them before we return a response. So I'm going to wrap everything in future, await future.wait, and we need to make sure we have an async over here. So basically all that we are doing is that let's go generate count over here returns us a list of future, right? And we are waiting for all these features to be resolved. Then we are going to have a list of responses. If you don't understand any part of this video, you can leave a comment down there and I'll respond to you. So what we need to check is that we need to first make sure if all the response we get from this endpoint is 200, the status code is 200. There are so many ways you can handle this, but I want to make sure that every call returns a status response before I return some data. So if response.every, which is just looking at error response, has a status code of 200, then I want to return a complete recipe from JSON using the response.data. But response.data isn't actually what we want, because response.data is going to give us this big JSON which doesn't have the actual information we need. So response.data is a big JSON, and we want to access a field called mails, right, which is this particular mails array over here. But within this array, we want only the first item. So if you look at this, mails is going to return a list over here, and within this list we want this particular JSON, which is this big object. So mails is an array. Because an array, we can access the first item like this, and now this is going to actually give us the JSON that our complete recipe from JSON constructor can understand. So this is what we are returning, and if every response is not a success, in this particular case I don't want to really throw an error. You can also throw an error if you want, but I just want to return an empty list, which means we don't have any random recipe. Now this is all that we need for our random recipe provider. Next, we need to generate the parts of this code that we need for Riverpod to work. So if you remember from the last video, we need to add a path declaration over here, and it should be the same name as the name of this file, just that it has to end with .g.dat. So we are going to add random recipe provider.g.dat, and then we need to run build runner. So open your terminal and then type that run build runner. Watch. Now watch to make sure that we don't run this command again. Now after running this, we have no errors, which means everything worked successfully. So we can proceed to use our random recipe provider. I'm going to create a separate widget to handle the list view for the recommended for you section. So I don't want to put everything over here, just like we did for the recipes categories. I want to put it below, right, within the recipes page. So I'll come here, and under recipes we have widgets over here, and this is where we have the recipes categories. So I'm going to create another widget, and I will call this recommended recipes. So you can call it anything you want, but I'm going to call it recommended recipes. So new file, recommended recipes.dat, and this is going to be a consumer widget. So Riverpod consumer, like this. All right, stateless consumer widget, and we are going to have recommended recipes. We have to make sure that we import everything over here, and we are not returning a container, but then we return some kind of a sizer box, right? So for now we can put a sizer box here, and that should fix everything. So let's render this recommended recipes on the recipes page. So over here I'm going to put recommended recipes here. Now we can't see anything because we are rendering a sizer box, but if we put a text over here, here we can see that appear just below the recommended for you. Now let's add a little bit of padding below the recommended for you so that it pushes this section downwards. So I'm going to add a bottom of 10, and I think that will do the trick for us. Now within this recommended recipes for you, this is where we are going to call our provider. So I'm going to create a variable here and then call it recipes, and this is going to be set to ref.watch random recipe provider. So let's import this like that, and we need to call this, right? So we need to call this like a function, and the reason is because we are providing some kind of parameter over here. So if you look at our recommended recipes provider, we are passing this count over here, which means that we cannot just leave it like this, right? We need to make a call. Now this is going to return us a list of complete recipes. So what do we do with this? Let's first have a sizer box to constrain the area that we want to scroll. So this is already a scrollable widget. If we nest another scrollable widget within it, we are going to get some issues in Flutter unless we constrain which part of the UI is scrollable. So let's first do that with a sizer box, and let's give it a height of 200. And this is the area within the list builder I want to be scrollable. Now let's have our usual check for when we have data or error or when we are loading. So we are going to do that using recipes.when. Now with this when, we can display different widgets or UIs based on the state that our provider is in. So in this particular case, when we are loading, we want to just have a spinner, but then within this spinner or around this spinner, we want to wrap it in a center widget so that the spinner is at the center of the page. When we have an error, we also want to show this error at the center of the page. When we have the data, this is when we want to show our list view that scrolls horizontally. So we are going to return a list view dot separated, and within this list view dot separated, item builder is the function that returns the actual UI you want to build. And in this case, we are going to use the same recipe card we built from the last video. In case you missed the last video, you want to check it out, I'll leave a link in the description. You can check it out. It's going to really help you to understand what we are doing over here. But basically, recipe card is just some UI, which is a widget, right? So this is how it looks like: a column with expanded and then a name, right? this recipe card. Now item count is going to be the total number of recipes we have, in this case data.length. Separator builder is how we want to separate each item within this list view. So I'm going to use a sizer box, and instead of width of 10, I'm going to provide it a width of 14. Now this isn't right, so let me create a variable over here for the recipe and set it to data index. Now with recipe card, you don't have to pass in a recipe, but I rather have to pass an image URL, which we can get from recipe.image URL, name, which comes from recipe.name, and we have to also pass in a callback, so which is on top like this. Let's first make sure that we are scrolling in the horizontal axis. So in order to do that, within the list view that's separated, there is a property here called scroll direction, and we want to set that to axis.horizontal. Right, we still can't see anything here. Hey, so it's me from the future. After a little bit of debugging, I realized we need to have a sizer box around the recipe card to constrain it, since there is no constraint within the recipe card itself. We need to have a maximum width for the recipe card. So I set it to 150 initially, but you can set it to any value that looks good for you. Also with the spacing, which is the separator border, we can maintain a value of 10 or any value that looks good for you, depending on the width you set for the recommended for you section. So this is going to be the recommended for you section over here. Now let's quickly continue to work on the recipes of the week section. It's almost the same as the recommended recipes for you, just that that section is a grid instead of a list view. Now back here, I'm going to duplicate this section over here. So copy and then paste this, and instead of it saying recommended recipes for you, we are going to put recipes of the week. So recipes of the week here. Now instead of recommended recipes, we are going to also have recipes of the week widget, and we can call it popular recipes or anything you like to call it. Personally, I prefer to call it popular recipes instead of recipes of the week, which is the name I'll give to the file, but it doesn't really matter. So over here under widgets, I'm going to create a new file and call it popular recipes.dat. Now this is going to be almost the same as the recommended for you, which I just talked about. So it's going to be a consumer, stateless consumer widget, and there is going to be popular recipes like this. Now instead of returning a container, we are going to return based on the data we have. So if you look at the recommended for you, we first need to get some kind of recipes, and then based on that data from the recipes, we show the appropriate UI. So I'm just going to copy this here and then bring it to the popular recipes, and I'm going to pass in, instead of the default 10, I'm going to pass in 14. That means I want 14 random recipes, and we can use the same approach we use on the recommendeds for you. So recipes.when, and when we have loading, which is the loading state, we want to show a spinner. This spinner, I want to wrap it with a center widget. When we have an error, we also want to show this error in the center of the screen or this particular widget. Finally, when there is data, we want to return a grid view builder. The item count is going to be the total number of items we have for this recipes, which is going to be 14 in this case. We're also going to have grid delegate, which is going to be a sliver grid delegate with max cross axis extent, and I explained this in the last two videos, and also the last video when we worked on this particular page, which is the category details page. So max cross axis extent is going to be 200, which is basically like the max width of anything that is going to be within the grid view. So if it's going to be a card, the maximum width before we add another column, right? So just take it like the maximum width. That's the easiest way to understand it. Main axis spacing, we are basically talking about the spacing between the items in the grid view, and if I bring this down a bit, so then like this. Now we need to add our item builder. So this is going to actually build the UI we want. Now we are going to retain the same recipe card. This time we don't need to wrap it in a sizer box because the grid view should take care of everything for us. Now we can't see our popular recipes because we are not rendering it anywhere. So back here, I just want to put the popular recipes here like this. And after it loads for a while, it should show something. Nothing is showing. Yeah, so it's because we have a list view, not a list view, but a scrollable widget within another scrollable widget. So in order to fix this, we can first set the shrink wrap property to true, and that is going to show this over here. But then it seems like we have another small section that you can scroll within. So we don't want this part to be scrollable, right? As you can see, I'm able to scroll this small section. We don't want this small section to be scrollable. Therefore, we are going to set the physics for this grid view to be never scrollable physics. And this way, this particular grid view is going to just act like a grid and not a scrollable widget. This is how we build the recommended for you section in the recipes of the week section. Now that is going to be all for today's video. Hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Let me know if you have any suggestions or questions in the comment section and I'll attend to them. Next, we'll be looking at how to build the recipe details page, how to implement bookmark and favorites, how to also save recipes locally, and a whole lot. You don't want to miss any of those things if you followed along to this particular section. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.